Hey guys, welcome to the show where we empower Christian entrepreneurs to build profitable businesses of eternal significance in order to make a redemptive economic impact. I am your host, Mike Hatch, and man, I am excited to dive into another timely issue that's on the minds of many business leaders today. This week, a local business owner, Sam, here in Pittsburgh, asked me a question that I believe is worth taking the time to unpack in depth. And that is, should Christians take out business loans? Sam, thank you for reaching out and asking this question, and man, I am excited to unpack this. So first of all, my short answer is as long as the loan isn't inflationary debt, there's nothing inherently wrong with a Christian taking out a business loan. In fact, it is a very redemptive economic exchange from a biblical perspective. But as with many things in economics, theology, life, the longer answer requires more nuance. As usual, we'll approach this question through a redemptive economic lens. We'll look at the dangers of inflationary debt, including most business loans, the redemptive potential of non-inflationary loans, and the kingdom impact of becoming a lender who blesses others through business loans. I'll build this case using several principles from the 15 redemptive economic principles, which I have created. And by the way, you can email me if you want a PDF copy of the 15 redemptive economic principles. I would be happy to send that to you. My email address is mhatch@redemptiveeconomics.com, and you can find that in the show notes. Also, I'm in the middle of a 12-part digital course called The Redemptive Enterprise, 15 Biblical Principles for Building a Profitable Business of Eternal Significance. I've been taking business leaders through this content to help them take the 15 redemptive economic principles and apply them to their business context. It's only $25 for the whole course, so you can register for it with the link in the show notes. If you register for the course, you can participate in the live sessions and the Q&As every Wednesday at 11:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. We're 5 weeks in to the 12-part series, and I would love to have you join us. And you do not need to attend the live sessions to participate. If you register, you'll actually receive each new session weekly. All right, let's get started. First of all, let's talk about the dangers of inflationary debt. Inflationary debt, whether it's a business loan, a car loan, a mortgage, or any other bank loan, money created through the expansion of the money supply is a form of theft. That may sound extreme, but it's a truth grounded in both scripture and sound economics. So here's how it works. When a bank originates a loan, it creates that money out of nothing. They simply type the digits into a computer and voila, that money springs into existence. Ex nihilo, that's Latin for out of nothing. That's, in fact, what Genesis says that God did, that he created ex nihilo, out of nothing. So only God is able to do that. Banks have the exorbitant privilege of lending money into existence and charging interest for the service. If that sounds off to you, or just not right, then you're tracking with me, because it's not. Here's a quote directly from the Federal Reserve's website. And they say this: when a loan is granted, a person is generally granted the money by adding to the balance on their bank account. Literally just typed in numbers into your bank account, added extra dollars based on the loan that you qualified for. Here's another quote. It says that, this quote actually contributes to the argument that it affects the money supply. It actually says, as banks increase and decrease loans, the nation's broad money supply increases or decreases. In other words, every time a bank loan is originated, it expands the supply of dollars, which devalues everyone else's dollars. Therefore, we are stealing value from other people who are holding dollars by taking out bank loans in order to fund our businesses. It is, when you think about it, it's the exact opposite of what we're trying to accomplish in our business, isn't it? To create value for others. We're in fact extracting value from others, or you could even say embezzling money in order to start or fund our business. I don't know about you, but that makes me really angry that I wasn't told about this when I go and take out my mortgage or my car loan. Not only that, but how else are we supposed to get a loan for things like that? We've been coerced into an exploitive system that is diametrically opposed to our values as Christians, and we have very few, if any, alternatives. But guys, that is why I do this podcast. I would have deeply appreciated someone informing me of these ethical and moral incongruencies. Scripture consistently condemns unjust weights and measures. Here's Deuteronomy chapter 25, verses 13 through 15. You shall not have in your bag differing weights, a heavy and a light. You shall not have in your house differing measures, a large and a small. You shall have a full and just weight. When central banks inflate the money supply to fund government programs or bail out failed institutions, they aren't creating value. They are redistributing wealth from savers and the poor to the politically connected. Look, this is not merely bad policy. It is literally a violation of God's law. By the way, there's another verse very similar to this in Deuteronomy. There's another verse in Leviticus that says almost the same exact thing. So as principle number 5 from the Redemptive Economic Principles states, it says, we uphold honest money, ethical banking, and investment practices in obedience to God's commands for just weights and measures. We reject theft through inflation and unjust taxation and financial corruption. Inflationary loans, especially those originating from fiat credit creation, trap entrepreneurs in a system of dependency and distortion. They encourage malinvestment, short-term thinking, and often funnel capital away from the local economy toward central institutions. This is completely opposite of God's purposes to decentralize capital for the benefit of local impact. When Christian business owners participate in this system, even unknowingly, we risk supporting a structure that is extractive and unjust. In recent years, companies like WeWork and Peloton were able to expand rapidly using cheap, inflation-fueled capital. But the inevitable correction revealed how unsustainable their models were. The damage was not just financial. Thousands of livelihoods were impacted. The story probably would have been different had they had to pay their dues and prove out the concept in order to get true, honest investment. Christians should be aware of the source of their financing and avoid aligning themselves with unjust systems that perpetuate economic oppression. All right, so are all loans off limits for Christians? Not at all. Not at all. Principle number 4, under creating kingdom value through faithful work, gives us a critical guideline. As God's people, our goal is to lend to many nations but borrow from none. We seek financial freedom using debt strategically for wealth creation rather than consumption. Lending to others can be a tool for kingdom expansion. Note that debt can be used strategically. The problem isn't debt itself, it's the kind of debt and the purpose of its use. If a Christian entrepreneur takes out a non-inflationary loan, say from a crowdfunding institution like Honeycomb Credit, a peer lender, or a private equity group, or through someone's donor advised fund, it can be completely in alignment with Scripture and very redemptive. But what makes it redemptive? Well, let's bring principle number 3 here to bear, which is, again, from cooperating in God's redemptive plan. It says this: our economic activity should reflect and proclaim the gospel, demonstrating integrity, generosity, and service to others in business. A redemptive loan is 4 things primarily. Number 1, it is transparent in its terms. It is mutually beneficial. Thirdly, it is designed to help the borrower create value for others. And then lastly, fourthly, it is free from coercive or deceptive structures. So ask yourself, does this loan help me bless others or merely help me consume more? Does it reflect God's wisdom, or am I leaning on worldly systems? If the answer is rooted in stewardship, value creation, and gospel impact, then the loan is likely a strategic tool in God's hands. So, how about becoming a lender who blesses? This is amazing. One of the most overlooked aspects of biblical economics is the call for God's people to become lenders. In Deuteronomy chapter 15, verse 6, we read, "For the Lord your God will bless you as he has promised, and you will lend to many nations, but will borrow from none." That's not just a promise to Israel. It's a vision of kingdom economic strength and maturity. God blesses his people so they can bless others. Some Christians object to all interest or conflate all forms of interest with usury, citing Old Testament laws that forbid it. But it's crucial to read those texts in context. The prohibition on charging interest in passages like Exodus 22, verse 25, and Leviticus 25, verses 35 through 37, those refer specifically to loans given to fellow Israelites who had fallen into poverty. These are meant to be acts of mercy, not commercial transactions. In Deuteronomy chapter 23, verse 20, Israel is explicitly allowed to charge interest to foreigners, those outside the covenant community, likely in commercial relationships. So the enduring moral principle here is to protect the vulnerable and avoid exploitation, not a blanket prohibition on interest. In modern business relationships, among equals, interest is not only permissible, but can be, like I said before, redemptive when it is fair, transparent, and productive. This perspective aligns perfectly with redemptive economic principles. Interest must never be extractive, but it can serve as a means to bless, grow, and steward capital for God's purposes. Paul actually touches on this in 2 Corinthians, where he implores the church of Corinth to give generously to another church in need. 2 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 13, it says, "Our desire is not that others might be relieved while you are hard-pressed, but that there might be equality. At the present time, your plenty will supply what they need. So in turn, their plenty will supply what you need." The goal is equality. As it is written, the one who gathered much did not have too much, and the one who gathered little did not have too little. Now, I understand this passage specifically, Paul is talking about charity, but the principle translates to business and enterprise. By offering a peer-to-peer business loan, you are offering your surplus to someone in need for the purposes of production and redemptive economic impact. Just as Paul says, in turn, their plenty will supply what you need, someone's business may be able to provide for your need in return for your investment, whether that's through their product or service or the profit you make in interest for loaning them the money. Principle number 1 under creating kingdom value through faithful work puts it this way: money, like seed, must not be hoarded, but should be actively invested to generate wealth that blesses others and glorifies God. If you have capital and the ability to lend without exploiting, you can become a conduit of kingdom growth. You can provide startup capital to a young entrepreneur, equipment financing to a church planter, or emergency funds to a struggling family business. Many Christian business owners are tempted to keep up with inflation by chasing speculative returns in the stock market. But the redemptive alternative is to invest in people locally. Don't just watch your assets grow. Watch God's kingdom grow through them. As I mentioned before, this is one of the core principles I teach in the Redemptive Enterprise digital course. Week by week, we unpack how to align your investments with your theology, how to build a business that reflects eternal priorities. If you're serious about growing a profitable business of eternal significance, again, I invite you to come join us. All right, let's talk about business loans and the local economy. Let's come back to something practical. Why does it matter whether a loan is inflationary or not? Because inflationary lending is extractive. When money is created out of thin air and lent into existence, it often flows into real estate, stocks, or leveraged corporate takeovers. That means capital is flowing out of local communities and into speculative bubbles. Non-inflationary lending, especially when it is relationship-based, keeps capital circulating within the community. It allows entrepreneurs to grow without becoming vassals to national banks or venture capital firms with no kingdom vision. Think of a Christian business owner in Pittsburgh who borrows, say, $25,000 from a local believer to upgrade his HVAC equipment. The repayment terms are fair. The equipment improves service quality and new jobs are created. That is redemptive economic activity, and it's not happening enough on a local level. In fact, here, let me give you a quick example that I use in the digital course. This really got me. So there are about 33 million businesses in the United States, and there is about $6 trillion invested in those businesses, mostly through private equity firms. Meanwhile, there is about $124 trillion of value represented in the stock market. Guess how many businesses are represented in the stock market? About 6,000. Most estimates are between 4,000 and 6,000, but I'm going to be generous and base these numbers on 6,000 businesses. That is a tiny speck in terms of percentages of the total number of businesses. That's literally 0.02% of the amount of businesses in the United States. So that means that 0.02% of all the businesses in the United States are getting 95% of the capital allocation through the stock market. That is crazy. I mean, you talk about Wall Street being prioritized over Main Street. There is something deeply unjust about this, and it's the main reason why I pulled our money out of the stock market back in 2018. But just think about it. $124 trillion represented in the stock market. Imagine if just those of us who were Christians decided to reallocate that capital to local enterprises, local businesses, and entrepreneurs and ventures. Man, imagine the redemptive impact that could happen. Man, that is my vision for redemptive economics. That is literally what redemptive economics means in this time and context in history. That is for Christians to take ownership of their own capital, their own resources, that they have been coerced to put into the stock market, and unleash them to make incredible redemptive impact locally. Man, that excites me. I don't know about you, but it excites me. But then contrast that with a loan backed by newly printed money that inflates the cost of everything, disproportionately hurting the poor. Look, that is just unjust. That is very unjust. We are called to build local resilience, not globalized dependency. And one of the ways we can do that is through non-inflationary business loans. All right, so I hear some of you saying, look, that's great ideal, but I'm going to fall behind in business. This is definitely the fear that I often hear. If I don't take the cheap money, I will lose my advantage and competitors will outgrow me. That may be true in the short term, but kingdom economics takes a long view. Remember, Jesus taught us in Mark chapter 8, verse 13. What does he say? He says, "What does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his soul?" And that's in effect what we're doing in this process. And then Matthew 25, he praises the servant in that parable who invests wisely according to his means. Not everyone receives 5 talents, but all are judged, what? On their faithfulness. This ultimately goes back to whether you trust God or not. Do you believe he is good, or do you believe he is evil? If you believe he is good and trustworthy, then we're going to be willing to embrace our role as steward, knowing that we will give an account before God and choose the narrow road that leads to life. Yes, it might be harder in the short term to secure funds than if we were to take out cheap money, but God will honor that in the long term and will provide in ways, guys, that we could never imagine. Just like Israel stepping into the Jordan River while it was still at flood stage. Look, I believe God is calling all of us as entrepreneurs to step out and trust the King of the universe with our businesses. When you resist the lure of cheap inflationary credit and instead operate your business in faith and wisdom, you may not scale as fast, but your foundation will be deeper and stronger. Your business will be more resilient, and your witness will shine brighter. And in the end, again, as Christians, we know this, the reward, of course, is higher profits in this life, but it's eternal significance in the next. So, should Christians take out business loans? The better question is, what kind of loan and for what purpose? If it is rooted in stewardship, based on honest money, aimed at creating value and structured to bless others, then yes, that loan can be a redemptive tool in God's hands. But if it is funded through inflationary fiat, taken for consumption or unsustainable speculation, or linked to unjust systems of coercion, then it may be better to walk away in faith and trust God to provide through other means. All right, let me leave you with this challenge. What does your financing say about your faith? Are you trusting in Babylon's system of debt, or are you walking in the freedom of God's provision? That's what the Old Testament prophet Jeremiah called the ancient paths. If you found this content helpful, I encourage you to check out my digital course, The Redemptive Enterprise, where we go deep into the biblical and economic principles behind kingdom entrepreneurship. Again, you can register for the course with the link in the show notes, or you can find out more at redemptiveeconomics.com. Remember, you can also always email me at mhatch@redemptiveeconomics.com. I would love to hear from you. Whether it's a question or a comment, I am looking for feedback and ideas for new content all the time. So please reach out to me. All right, gang, thanks for listening. And remember, building a profitable business is great, but it's also about how we do that. Let's build in a way that stands the test of God's fiery test at the judgment and yields eternal reward for the eternal significance of our business. Let's get to work!